Long days and pleasant nights, fellow travelers along the path of the beam. Jaime and Fuego here, and yes, I'm going to alter the introduction just a little bit because this is not a Hail to Stephen King segment. This is, in fact, the first in a while of Run to the Hill. That's right. Joe Hill, the son of Cy King, just put out his new short story collection last month in October. Cecil and I had the awesome opportunity to actually see him speak to an audience and give some insight and stuff like that. And these stories go as recent as just right before this went to publication and all the way back to 2006, I believe, with Thumbprint. So being the fact that there's a lot of stories here, I'm going to try to keep it as brief as I give just a little mention for each of them. Now, first and foremost, I have reviewed Thumbprint on this channel already previously, as well as In the Tall Grass, and Throttle, I believe it is, yes. So Throttle and In the Tall Grass were both written with Joe's father, Stephen King, and so they've been floating around for a little while. In the Tall Grass was recently adapted into a film by the director of Cube and Splice. It's on Netflix right now. In the Tall Grass is, as a short story, you know, if you want to hear my extensive thoughts, you know, jump to that other review. It's in the Stephen King themed playlist, but it's a lean, mean, and very unapologetically vicious short story, especially one particular thing that happens with a mother, and you know, without really getting into anything specific, it deals with religious fanaticism, and you know, it's kind of claustrophobic in the fact that it's about this brother and sister duo who get lost in this tall field of grass in the middle of the Midwest, where they try to go and assist this kid. So that one I've talked about previously, and then Throttle also being one that I've mentioned as well, just for those who maybe haven't seen that video. It's essentially about these meth cooking biker gangs that they just piss off this guy in this huge 18-wheeler vehicle, and he proceeds to try to just knock all of them off the road one by one. But there's also a dueling dynamic of this father who's essentially the leader of the gang, and his younger son, who is a real little piece of shite, and he's doing too much of the meth, and he was responsible for this house blowing up at the very beginning of the story that they were cooking drugs in. Some of it actually takes place here in Arizona, which is cool, but it's this estranged son with his father, and his father still loving him, but knowing how much of a piece of crap his kid has been since coming back from Iraq. And so, lastly, Thumbprint being a story about this woman, once again, dealing with just slight bits of PTSD and difficulties after coming back from the war over there. And this is one where I'm trying to recall the name of it was the prison, Abu Ghraib or something like that, but it was essentially where all of those photos came out of the insane mistreatment that the guards were putting these war on terror prisoners through. They were stripping them of all their clothes, they were stacking them up and taking these silly photos next to them, almost like they were prizes or something. And so a woman who was at that notorious prison that was in fact shut down, the whole story is about her coming back home and being terrorized by this person who starts sending her thumbs and stuff. And she's kind of a messed up person herself. She's bartending and waitressing at this place, and this drunk regular, he's hanging out of his vehicle one evening as she's trying to leave, and she's kind of messing around with a married guy. Besides that, the guy who's hanging out of his vehicle, she steals a bunch of money out of his wallet and his wedding ring, of all things, and then in turn drops it down the drain. This all happens at the beginning of the story before she starts getting really properly terrorized. Thumbprint was also made into a graphic novel where they make the character a little bit more sympathetic, and while the art is very cool, I can't say I liked it as much, and it didn't hit quite as hard, especially as the ending here. So as I jumped through a couple others, with all of these being pretty much previously released with the exception of just a few, Dark Carousel is one. It's a period piece in the 90s about this group of 4 friends. There's a brother and sister duo who are in turn, dating, another guy and another girl respectively. And it's the end of summer. It's the end of, the summer after having graduated from high school. And so they're all going to end up being kind of sent away. One is being forced into joining the military because of some trouble with the law that he got in. His sister is going to be staying back in town, and our lead character, who is the one who the story is told from the perspective of, he's dating the sister, and he's going off to college, and he kind of knows the relationship is going to be strained, if not completely donezo. And so that's our setup. There's just these two couples, and they basically go to this carnival, and they get on this crazy dark carousel, and there's this really super creeped out guy who's working the machine and everything, or the ride, I should say. That's maybe a little bit better of a descriptor. And in turn, there is something otherworldly and vengeful about this carousel of different horses and animals and such that are on this thing. That was actually previously released as a vinyl, which on one side was somebody reading the story as an audiobook, and then on the other side was a cover of Wild Horses, the Rolling Stones song, and it really ties in, especially with the grisly conclusion that we get in this. Wolverton Station, this was not one of my personal favorites, but it's very much about this guy who he's traveling around in England, and he is positive that there are werewolves on this train with him. It's definitely got an American Werewolf in London vibe to it, at least a little bit. Either that or the Werewolves of London, that song by Warren Zevon, I'm going to say. But not one of my favorites, a little more on the shorter side. Moving on, we have By the Silver Water of Lake Champlain. This was just recently adapted into an episode of Creepshow, the 6th and final episode, directed by Tom Savini, of all people. And while I most definitely enjoyed what they did with it, because it really has this Big Blue, Nessie type vibe to it, and Big Blue, I'm making an X-Files reference there for those who picked up on that. Quick way. But so there's this lake, and there's this long-running urban legend that there is in fact one of those aquatic dinosaurs that lives in it. And whereas the characters are made a little bit older in the Creepshow episode, and there's also an angle of an abusive stepfather, which is not in the source material. The source material left me so genuinely happy just because of how sweetly these kids that discover this dinosaur, this dead aquatic dinosaur washed up on shore. They think it's a big rock at first. They go and they walk around on it and stuff, and they realize, lo and behold, it is in fact that aforementioned dinosaur. So that story has a serious sweetness to it that just it hit me in the feels, so much more so in the source material, and just the language that Joe put together, and just the sweet camaraderie. And he writes kids very much like his father, incredibly well and very believably, and with just that that really cute innocence to them and stuff. So that is definitely one of my personal favorites. Next up, we had Fawn, and Fawn was, without going into too much detail, it's one of the longest stories in this collection, and it's essentially about this trophy hunter guy who is going all over the world, essentially, going on these crazy big game hunts, and he's aspired to kill the biggest and most fearsome predators on the planet. He's been to Africa, he's been all over the place, killed lions, tigers, bears, oh my, all over the place. But he gets wind through this contact of his about this hunt in a place where not only is the price so extravagantly insane, but you can't actually take anything you kill with you, because the stuff that is in this hunting ground is so rare that it has to be left with the person who organizes the hunt in this weird little mini museum, trophy display place that he has. So sounds suspect until you realize that you're actually going on a hunt in a different dimension, almost like a fantasy type dimension of sorts. And yes, the term fawn, it applies very, very distinctively here with the type of hunt that our dude is going on. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Not a personal favorite there as well, but still an intriguing concept, and just shows how different Joe's ideas are than his father's. And I really appreciate that he's not just trying to emulate his Papa Bear. He's really forging forward and doing his own thing, and this story is definitely evidence of that being the case. Another one, which it's completely different. So many of these stories, they range from the dramatic to the scarific to the very grounded to the otherworldly. It is just to even borderline sci-fi, with another one of my favorites I'm about to get to. But Late Returns definitely has a sci-fi type vibe to it. It's about this guy who returns home to settle his parents' estate, since they are both passed away now, and he essentially comes across it's a bookmobile that he decides to start driving. So literally like a big vehicle that is like a portable little library, and turns out it's also a time machine. And so he starts coming across people that have been long since dead, and yet they are still alive because this, this amped up instructionary, DeLorean for the reading rainbow quotient is really just, I don't know, it's something far beyond power-wise anything that he could have imagined, and the power of reading, everybody. And it's a really sweet story. It's one of those hit you in the feels. It's not of the scary variety. So, you know how I said that there are some that are just really nostalgic and sentimental and more along the lines of his father's work, like A Stand By Me, or, it's just, has that sort of just, sweet otherworldliness to it. And Late Returns is one of the strongest, and definitely one of the selections here that people have been talking about the most. And Joe actually mentioned it specifically when he was at that when he was doing that reading that Cecil and I attended. Next up, All I Care About Is You. This really, really took me off guard as far as how much I enjoyed it and how much it floored me, especially with the ending, which obviously this is not spoilers here, but the ending to this was gut punch worthy. And it's futuristic. It's got a very, very Philip K. Dick type vibe, big time Blade Runner type vibe, in the fact that it's androids, cyborgs, whatever you want to call them, robots, they are very much commonplace in this future that this young lady that we basically follow in this story encounters. And she decides to, since she has her birthday and there's nobody for her to spend it with, and she's a younger girl, she's like a teenager, that she decides to put some money into one of these older models of an android, and his little motto is, for the next hour, all I care about is you, which is where we get the vibe. And they have just a very interesting interaction back and forth of him trying to pick her brain a little bit and understand, humankind better, and some of her cynicism and immaturity, and yet it's a very fascinating relationship, the way this time that the two of them spend pans out. And just once again, the ending it's strong. It's really strong, and especially if you like when King and his kid have veered into science fiction. This story is also read by Ashley Cummings on the audiobook. So what I like to do, whether it's a Cy King book, whether it's a Joe Hill story, I like to both read through all of the stories first, and then I also listen to the Audible, the audiobooks.com, Scribd. I think this is on there as well. So whatever destination you like to go to for listening to audiobooks, I'd like to also listen to it as well. And it's great with what King and his son now as well have done with their short stories, is they'll bring in a different reader for each one. And so Ashley Cummings was from Hounds of Love, and she also most recently starred in Nosferatu. She reads this story. You've got Zachary Quinto reading stuff. You've got Stephen Lang. I mean, you have Joe Hill even reads a few bits himself, including one of my absolute favorites on here. So even if you're not big into reading the source material and stuff, I mean, if you just like to listen, the audiobook's terrific in that regard. So I had to at least briefly make mention of that. Already talked about Thumbprint. One of the most unique in this, and maybe one of my least favorite, but novel in the concept of the way the way Hill actually typed it up himself. So The Devil on the Staircase. This is about a guy who, it's a younger boy, actually, and abusive family member. I'm trying to remember if it was a father or an uncle, but just, constantly mistreating him. I believe it was his father. And he loves, his cats more than he does his son, and puts his son through, very extensive hard labor. The son gets obsessed with, I'm trying to remember if it was a cousin of his, this older girl. I think it was a cousin, but it just really, since it's such a short story and there's very little to spoil, he ends up having this phobia of these stairs basically going down to hell, and that's about as much as I can say. But the thing that's cool about the way that it's actually typed up and put together, and I hope you guys can actually see this if I can get close enough. So you see how right over here, the way that he actually typed up some of these big sections and paragraphs as stairs, that was the little novel approach in the way that he put this together, which I really, really appreciated. It might be my least favorite story in the collection, though, I have to say. It was decent, but nothing immensely memorable. Also talk about another one that was a big gimmick, Twittering from the Circus of the Dead. So this was essentially like 25, almost 30 pages, if I remember, of nothing but tweets. So just tweet after tweet after tweet, tweet-a-litty, and it still tells a story, though. It's about this high school girl who is miserably traveling from California to Colorado on this ski trip with her younger brother, who's got some like cross-dressing leanings and likes to put on her pantyhose and stuff, and yet still wants to hook up with the goth girl that his older sister is kind of friends with at school. But you've got bickery parents. She seems to really hate her mother, and her mother hates her being on social media constantly. And so to drive her mother nuts, what does she do? She's constantly tweeting, and that's how we find out what her story is by each of these individual little messages to the internet of less than 140 characters, and they range from just a few words in some instances to just a full-fledged, like, practical paragraph. And the Circus of the Dead aspect is once we get to the twist in this, and it goes from angst and just, adolescent whateverness and silliness in some ways to the actual guts of the story, that's where it gets incredibly interesting. And the framing device, it doesn't deter. It's very gimmicky, obviously, but what a cool and unique one to employ for telling your story. And once again, that just shows the creativity of this King kid. My God, is he just going higher and higher in the tier as far as just, current writers that I respect the hell out of. Essentially, the family, to get some culture, takes a detour, and they end up at a Circus of the Dead, literally. A circus event that has zombies in it, and the actual danger of death for not just audience members, but also performers in this circus that are still alive. This ringmaster woman who's all gothed out and stuff, she's on stilts when they first get there, and she's telling them about the danger of everything, and yet the family thinks it's all an act, just like all the rest of the people. And even as throats are getting ripped out and people are getting clawed to shreds and stuff, they're just like, wow, this looks really realistic. They think it's all part of the show, and lo and behold, it just gets crazier and crazier. That story was actually super, super cool, and it was one of the final ones that I read. It's not available on the audiobook. It is downloadable as a special PDF, though. So there's only a couple stories left. We are right here near the end of things, and I already mentioned In the Tall Grass, so we're not going to go to that, but two of the last three, Mums and You Are Released, are two of the strongest and absolute best on here. Mums is about this kid whose mother apparently suffered from mental illness, and she was also a super raging alcoholic, and that's kind of how, along with pills, she tried to quell all of these raging thoughts within her head, was through, both pill and bottle. And she dies. She slips in the shower and dies shortly after having just left the family. And she has left the family and her son because of the fact that they're basically these separatists, like Timothy McVeigh types, trying to make bombs. And you definitely get Joe Hill's personal politics and just social outlook very much in this story. But then the story takes a twist, and it becomes about mental illness and certain parallels between the child and his mother. And it kind of gets borderline horrifying to a point, in my estimation. And Mums is apparently, I thought it was, when I just saw the title on paper, a reference to his mother and stuff, but it's a dueling sort of reference, because he goes after they bury her and he plants a bunch of mums, the flower, on his mother's grave. And they start to grow, and he thinks he hears them talking to him. And this is where you start to question this kid's mental state, and this is where I cannot say anything else about this story, but it's so layered in the themes, from the extreme right-wing stuff, which is very frightening when it gets to that extreme. I'm not here to talk politics, obviously, but just also the nature of, is this all real? And, what's just the nature of reality and mental stability and the stuff and the plight of this kid. And it's crazy. I love this story. It might challenge as my favorite in this, if not for the fact that You Are Released, which is another one, And the final one in this, it was previously published in the Cemetery Dance collection, which was edited by Bev Vincent and Stephen King himself, called Flight or Fright. And each of the stories, some new and some old, were all about just terror on airplanes. And "you are released" is apparently a phrase which is uttered by air traffic controller people, where apparently you're all in the clear for landing, everything is fine, whatever. This story is essentially, without spoiling, about if the apocalypse started to transpire, as in nuclear holocaust, if all the bombs started getting launched by North Korea and Russia and, the United States, if you were up on an airplane and you have all of these different characters. You've got this little girl going to a spelling bee. You've got this older aging actress and her young little hotsy-totsy stud muffin. And just, it's a very fascinating assortment of people. And it does, in some ways, have correlations in that regard with the vast cast to the Langoliers and what King did with that. But just the idea of being on an airplane as nuclear holocaust is transpiring and all of these bombs are in the air, and you hear about the destruction of this nation because they're still getting reports up on the plane and they can't land, and so they're circling, and it's such a real life scary scenario. Nothing supernatural going on here, and yet I found it immensely unsettling, and it rounds out the book perfectly. Lastly, Joe Hill bookends with interesting insight, first and foremost in an introduction called Who's Your Daddy, which is all about his father, and how his father and his father's friends and contemporaries like Tom Savini and George Romero and various others influenced him significantly, and he gives a lot of just interesting background about what it was like growing up the son of a horror icon. It's heartfelt, it's beautiful, and I can't recommend the hell out of reading that part too. And then in the end, you've got just a little paragraph or so story note about each of these. So, man, Cy King's kid, he did good. He really did good. Joe Hill has forged his own voice in this industry. He's got new comic books that he's doing. He's working on a new novel. He's got tons of properties in development, from Lock and Key, which has some new stuff coming out as that's correlating with the release next year of the Netflix television series of that show that he's been trying to get off the ground for a decade. So, man, talk about talent not falling far from the tree. Definitely seek out. I really enjoyed 20th Century Ghosts, his first short story collection, but this is so matured and so varied. Not that the previous one wasn't, but you can just hear his voice getting stronger and the ideas being even more diverse and original. And yes, Full Throttle, stories by Joe Hill. Make the effort to go and check it out. That's right, run to the hill. So I've been Jaime and Fuego, and yes, it is greatly appreciated having you stop in for this. Don't forget to check out Hail to Stephen King every Spooktacular Saturday, and there's also a few back episodes of Run to the Hill where Cecil and I talked about the Nosferatu book, and also the TV series for that, and a few other things here and there. So I guess until next time, Fright fans, I've been Fuego once more, and remember, stay scared. And read Joe Hill.